Hello, and welcome to the online lecture for chapters 3, 6, and 7. So, you've made it past the first speech, and now you're gearing up for speeches that have a little more substance, a little heavier requirements, involve a little bit deeper digging. So, we're going to talk about some strategies and some things you need to think about as you move forward and give an informative speech, an indictment speech, a propositional speech, and any speech you might give in the future. Hopefully by now you've worked out some of the kinks that come along with taking a speech course online. None of us will pretend that that's an easy thing to do. There are a lot of things to work out. But whether you give a speech online or face-to-face, you still have some things you need to think about. And we're going to start by talking about one big word that you really need to always think about, and that is the word audience. Because your speech should always be tailored to your audience. Think of the words coming out of your mouth as a gift. You're giving them to somebody else. Who are you giving them to? You wouldn't give your grandma a gift card to Hollister or American Eagle, right? This doesn't make sense. And you probably wouldn't give your little sister, I don't know, you wouldn't give your 8-year-old sister a gift card to Starbucks, because that doesn't really make sense, right? You want to give a gift in a way that makes sense. So tailor your gift, show some thought, and tailor it to your audience. So to do that, you need to know some things about your audience. You can even just do a simple analysis. What's the general age of your audience? How many people are going to be in it? What's their gender composition? And don't make assumptions that there's only male and female. Because as a researcher who studies gender and communication, I can tell you that's not true. There are many people that don't identify with either, that identify with both. So don't make those assumptions. What's the educational level? What are their occupations? How much money do you think they make? Where are they from? A speech to people in Chicago is going to be a lot different than people in South Dakota. Maybe, maybe not. What's the level of cultural diversity that's represented? Are they politically affiliated? Can you guess their political affiliations? What are their religious affiliations? Again, if you can guess. What's their sexual orientation or other identities? Even their ability. And then are there any special interests to the group? Is there something that they're unified or rallied around? For instance, if you're giving a speech at a PTA meeting, everybody cares that the success of their children is at the forefront. Those are some basic things you can think about your audience. And in general, really what you need to do is kind of stereotype people, to be quite frank. Stereotypes are often bad, but can be good because we need stereotypes to help us kind of organize people groups in a way that allows us to kind of situate them in our cognitive framework. So I'm not saying make assumptions about their ideologies and their worldview and their worth based on their stereotypes, but as much as you can, attempt to classify your audience. That way you can tailor your speech to who they are. Once you've figured out who your audience is, you can then more closely think about your topic and your thesis. Hopefully by now you understand the similarities and differences between the two. Your topic is basically the overarching idea that you're trying to get across or that you're focusing on in a speech. You might focus on medical marijuana. You might focus on free trade coffee. You might focus on gay marriage or marriage. I don't think there is gay marriage. It's just marriage. You could focus on anything. So don't think too much about topic because anything can be a topic. What's interesting to you? But it's not just enough to have a topic. You've got to really narrow that down and create a thesis. So if your topic is marriage or marriage equality, gay marriage, a thesis statement would be gay people, LGBTQ individuals deserve the same rights, protections, and freedoms as heterosexual individuals in the United States. That's a thesis statement. In it, there are beliefs. There's a direction that the speech is going to follow. It gives you kind of one grounded piece upon which to build your speech. I'm not going to delve too much into how to develop a thesis topic because I think you're intelligent individuals, and if you're reading the chapters like you should be, it should make sense. But if not, you can always send me any questions you have. But again, it goes beyond this too. It's not enough to just analyze your audience, not enough to just analyze your topic, not enough just to have a thesis statement. You need to outline it. And we're going to talk about outlining in this chapter and then again in another chapter because it's so important. Let me be clear. You must submit an outline for your speech, and you must follow an appropriate format. This is a speech class, so I'm really focused on you articulating a speech well, but we can't separate speech and writing. They're integrated, and so that involves developing a good outline, and a good outline should look like this. You need to have an introduction. You can't just jump into your content. Just like in a speech, you wouldn't say, starting right now, main point number 1, I'd like to talk about, no, that's terrible, right? So if I'm giving a speech, let's roll with the marriage equality thing, right? Introduction. An introduction might be something like this, and this is maybe a boring one because it's off the top of my head, so forgive me, but in 2012, America took one giant step forward. Hundreds of years ago, we've moved past terrible discrimination in the world. We've moved past slavery. We've moved past gross discrimination against women. And we're finally moving past gross discrimination against people whose sexuality might differ from ours. I'm, of course, talking about marriage equality and the case for gay marriage in the United States. Okay, that's an introduction. I'm not saying it's perfect, because again, it's off the top of my head, but do you see what I'm doing there? I'm really setting the stage for kind of a story, right? For something to unfold beyond that. In it, you can see where I'm heading, what my side is, because there's always a side. After that introduction, you then give a preview. So you would say, in this speech today, I'm going to talk about, number 1, the history of marriage in the United States and the importance of it within our country's framework. Number 2, discrimination against LGBTQ couples. And 3, the recent policy reformations that are allowing LGBTQ individuals to receive the same rights and provisions of marriage in the United States as heterosexual couples. Basically, what you're doing there is telling us what you're going to tell us. Tell us what the 3 main points are going to be, and then explore them. Main point number 1. Let's talk about the importance of marriage in the United States. Underneath that main point, you're going to have subpoints. This is the content, the real meat of your speech. How are you going to talk about it? What is the importance of the marriage in the United States? Why do we get married? Well, there's some research there, and that's where your supporting evidence comes in. So you can talk about the importance of marriage in the United States. Marriage is very, very important in the United States. We can support that assertion because looking at census data, we see that 87% of United States citizens are married. That's a false statistic. I don't know, again, completely off the top of my head, but do you see what I'm doing there? I'm providing evidence. We'll talk a little bit more about how to cite evidence appropriately, but know that you need it. You need to have evidence. You need to give as much information about that evidence as possible, and that evidence needs to be credible. So you do these 3 main points. At the end, you have a review, which is just like the preview. You tell us what you told us. You say, so just to recap, today in this speech I talked about the importance of marriage equality in the United States. Then I talked about the history of discrimination against LGBTQ couples. And finally, I wrapped up by noting that there is hope, that we're moving in a great direction, and that LGBTQ individuals are finally entering into the place where they have the same rights and provisions of marriage as heterosexual couples. So to conclude, I want to commend our policymakers, our local officials, and anybody who's engaged in the fight for marriage equality. We took a giant step forward. Let's make sure that we don't take 3 steps back. See what I did there? I have a firm conclusion. I tied it back to what I did in the intro. I used the same type of language, the same feel, the same theme, and I had a definitive ending. Never end your speech by saying, and that's it. Don't do that. Oh my gosh, don't do that. Have a definitive end and stop. That's it. Don't say thank you. Don't say, yep, that's it. I'm done. All right. Don't do that weird stuff. Just have a definitive introduction and a definitive conclusion. Between each of these, you need to have what's called a transition. You can't say main point number 1, some point, main point number 2. No. Kind of recap where you're going and where you've come from. So if you get to this subpoint right here after main point number 1, which could be, so main point number 1 we said was the importance of marriage in the United States. So a transition could look something like this. Now that we've looked at how important marriage is in the United States, let's look at some of the consequences for alienating certain people groups and not affording them the same rights and privileges of marriage. And then I move to main point number 2, where I talk about LGBTQ discrimination. See what I did? Very, very easy. It helps us as the audience to know where you're going and where you've come from, and it helps you be organized. It gives you a second to kind of get your thoughts together, to switch gears. Like I said, we're going to talk more about support and evidence, and that's where we're going next. So what counts as support or evidence? Well, basically, the textbook says almost anything. You can use almost anything you want to kind of validate what you have to say. Above all, it's critical that you realize that your words alone are not sufficient. You have to use sources. You might choose to use popular press sources. This is a good first start. This is things like the New York Times, CNN, Fox News, MSNBC, any of those major news sources. Are they perfect sources? No, because all news is biased, whether we choose to acknowledge that or not. So these are not perfect sources, but they do help us frame topics. So this is New York Times from Sunday, May 5th, 2013. And on the front, you see this picture. This was the terrorist who bombed the Boston Marathon. So the New York Times would be a really good source to talk about what happened at the Boston Marathon. You may know what happened at the Boston Marathon, but by situating your topic, your ideas, your words within the words of this New York Times or any other news source, you validate it a little bit more, because that gives your audience something they can go to check what you're saying. The best sources are things that you can find in a library or through a library database. Books and peer-reviewed journal articles. Those, especially peer-reviewed journal articles, are almost perfect sources. Doesn't mean they're never wrong, but peer-reviewed simply means that it goes through a blind review process. An article goes to reviewers, they look at it without knowing who wrote it, and they're able to critique it in a non-biased way. They make recommendations for revisions, and that person revises, resubmits. It's a really good process to ensure that the data that gets out there is non-biased. It is as true can ever be. This is not a research course. While I would love it to be, we don't have enough time to cover everything you need to do in a research course. You should have taken supplemental courses here at NSU that show you how to research effectively. If you don't, you need to contact the Beulah Williams Library. Contact information is over here. There's also a handy-dandy Ask a Librarian chat, which is great. I actually use it all the time, even as an instructor. Please get with the library. They can help you find sources for your speech. They are the appropriate resource to go to. Let's talk about some sources that are off limits. Number 1, Wikipedia. Never use Wikipedia as a source. That said, here's a caveat. At the bottom of almost every Wikipedia article, they have a reference list. Feel free to explore those references. Follow their links, see what those references have to say, and if those work, use those, but never cite Wikipedia. Never cite things like question and answer forums online, like Yahoo Questions or anything like that. Never cite Facebook, anything like that, unless you're giving a speech on Facebook and its policies, and you could use its policies as a source. But hopefully you know, use your judgment what's a good source and what's not a good source. But in general, stay away from things that cannot be verified or can be changed at a moment's notice. I want to briefly talk about speaking notes. You are not expected to give the speech off the top of your head. In fact, I encourage you to use note cards. But that said, you must use note cards. I do not want to see a piece of paper in front of you, and you will be required to lift up and show your speaking notes. So I will know if you're using a piece of paper or not. Even if you didn't lift that paper up, I would still know you're doing it, because I've been teaching this for many years, and it's very obvious who is using note cards and who is using paper. Your note card should look maybe something like this. There's no systematic formula for a perfect note card, because really it's up to you. I would encourage you to have note cards that have very little information on them. You should have practiced your speech so much that you don't need a lot of information. Put things on there to jog your memory. Put your source citations on there, the evidence that you use. But in general, don't overcrowd them, because you don't want to be reading from your note cards. Let me be clear, you will be deducted significantly if you do that. Really, above all, the best thing to do is simply practice. You should not ever, 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 ever submit a speech for this course that has not been practiced at least 3 times. Practice it in your head silently, practice it aloud, practice it in front of a friend, practice it in front of several friends. Do what you need to do, but you must practice. And you must show that you have clearly thought out and organized your speech in an appropriate way. Now, there are many different ways you can organize a speech topic. So if you were giving a speech on the Boston Marathon bombings, this is what we call a topical pattern of organization. Really, it's a speech that's organized around a specific idea or event. It can be organized kind of any way. This is kind of the general catch-all pattern. Then we have spatial patterns. So if you were giving a speech maybe on improving the campus layout at NSU, you hate it when it snows, the sidewalks are slippery because they go downhill ever so slightly, and if we rearranged XYZ and over by the Union here and up by the dorms here, things could be a lot different. Well, you're giving a speech about the space and the relationship between space and place, so that's a spatial pattern. You then have a chronological pattern. This is appropriate for speeches in which you maybe give a history of something. So if you're giving a history of gender equity in the United States, how second wave feminism in the 1960s led to women entering corporate America, and despite the fact that women still make 70 cents on the dollar for every dollar men make, we are moving and inching closer towards gender equity in the United States. You might give a history, therefore a chronology of gender equity. And then you have a logical pattern. So if you're giving a speech on legalizing, let's say, medical marijuana, you might say, there are specific issues that have been empirically proven to be remedied through the use of medical marijuana. We know that medical marijuana is a natural medicine, and that its side effects are no different or maybe less than pharmaceutically produced medications. Therefore, logically, it makes sense that we would move to recommending proven natural remedies for health issues. I'm not saying that's my position or anything, so don't get me arrested, but I'm just saying that's what a logical pattern would look like. And the way you can kind of see this pattern manifesting is through the outline. If you start on page 45 of your textbook and go all the way to the end of the chapter on page 48, you can see what a good outline looks like. I want you to follow that template, please. Briefly, I want to again remind you that you do have to have research in your speech. Again, this is not a research course, but there are some basic requirements of the evidence that you use. Your evidence should be current, it should be credible, and it should be comprehensive. Now, there are always ways out of these. If you are giving a speech on the history of gender equity, it makes sense to pull a source out of the 1960s, right? That makes sense. But in general, you want your evidence to be as current as possible. So if you're giving a speech on Ebola, a source from 2011 has a whole different meaning to your audience than a source from 2014. Why? Because there was a worldwide pandemic or epidemic related to Ebola in 2014. So it makes sense to use current resources. Always make sure the sources you use are credible. This is why I recommend going to the library, because those sources are all the more credible. And make sure that it's comprehensive. Your source should help you say what you're trying to say. It shouldn't leave any gaps. Above all, you need to think about the research that you pull. Focus on your thesis. What is your argument? Don't just use the first research you find. Don't just go to Google, search for your topic, and use that. That's not good speech behavior. Think critically about all of it. Use whatever you need to do to get that information across. There are other sources that are good too. You are a good source. If you've got a personal story, talk about it. I study body image and things related to body and gender. I've told you that a couple times now. And one of the reasons I do that is because I used to be 365 pounds. In 2011, I decided to make a lifestyle change, and now, sitting here, I'm 220 pounds and I'm still attempting to lose more weight. That's a personal story. A lot of people become interested in that. That's a pretty significant amount of weight loss, 140 pounds. So, talk about that. That's really powerful. If you're giving a speech about obesity or health or exercise, talk about your personal story. That makes sense and is appropriate. You might choose to interview other individuals, people who have lost weight, interview experts on the issue. Talk about their experience. Use library resources, use digital resources, use anything you can find. Just make sure that you really closely think about the quality of that source. Your textbook on page 54 through 56 gives you some good ideas or good ways to frame a source, looking at its accuracy, looking at its authority, looking at how current it is, looking at how objective it is, and looking at its scope. So please make sure that you really closely think about the quality of that source. And that's really what I want you to do through this speech and through the upcoming speeches, is to think about everything. Do what you do deliberately. Don't do it just because you're trying to throw an assignment together. Think critically and do excellent work. So that's all we've got for this lecture. Thanks for tuning in, and until next time, have a good one.